All right, welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into something I think a lot of you have probably wondered about. How much does your childhood, those early years, actually affect your relationships now as an adult?
It's a big question, and one that I think, yeah, a lot of people kind of suspect is at play in their own lives.
Right. You sense like some of the maybe not so great stuff in your relationships isn't exactly brand new.
Exactly. There are these echoes of the past that we carry with us, and we often don't even realize how much they're influencing the way we connect with others romantically.
So our mission today is to really get clear on the key ways childhood impacts your love life.
We're going to be looking at it from a few different angles, drawing on what we know from research and different schools of thought.
But it's not just about understanding the past, right? I think a lot of you are probably wondering, okay, so how much am I just doomed to repeat these old patterns? Or can I actually change things?
Right, we want to address that too.
And ultimately, we're going to point you towards some real strategies for building healthier, more fulfilling relationships.
So to get there, we're going to focus on a few core elements. First, we're going to start with attachment theory. This is really fundamental to understanding how those earliest bonds we form shape our expectations for relationships later on.
Okay, attachment theory. I think a lot of people have at least heard of it, but maybe not totally clear on what it means.
Well, the basic idea is that the way your caregivers responded to you as a child, how they met your needs, really created a sort of internal working model, almost a blueprint for what you expect from love and connection as an adult.
So, like, if your parents were super attentive and consistently there for you, you might grow up with this sense that love is reliable and safe.
Exactly. And that would be what's called a secure attachment style. People with this style tend to have more stable relationships. They find it easier to trust. They're comfortable with intimacy.
Yeah, and they don't freak out if their partner, like, needs a little space or has a life outside the relationship.
Right. There's a healthy balance between wanting closeness and being okay with independence.
Makes sense. But what if those early experiences weren't so great? What if your parents were, I don't know, inconsistent?
Well, then we start to see the other attachment styles emerge.
Like anxious attachment.
Exactly. If your caregivers were sometimes loving and attentive, but then other times distant or preoccupied, you might develop an anxious attachment style.
So it's like you never really knew what to expect.
Right. And that unpredictability can create this deep-seated fear of abandonment. As an adult, you might find yourself constantly seeking reassurance from your partner, overthinking things, worrying about whether they still love you.
It can be exhausting.
It can be. It's like this constant need to make sure you're still loved and accepted.
Okay, so anxious attachment. What about avoidant attachment? What's going on there?
So with avoidant attachment, the early experience was often one where emotional needs were kind of dismissed or ignored.
So you learn to just not rely on others?
Exactly. You learn that depending on others isn't safe. And as an adult, this can manifest as a strong need for independence, a difficulty with vulnerability and intimacy.
You might even push people away, even if you secretly want connection.
Right. It's like you're protecting yourself by keeping everyone at arm's length.
Okay, and then there's the fourth one, the one that sounds, I don't know, maybe the most complex.
Disorganized attachment?
Yeah, disorganized. What makes this one so tricky?
Disorganized attachment often develops in situations where a child experiences a confusing mix of fear and comfort from their caregiver. This could be in cases of abuse or neglect. It's like the person who's supposed to be your source of safety is also the source of your fear.
Wow, that must be so disorienting.
It is. And in adult relationships, it can lead to these really chaotic patterns. You might crave closeness, but then also fear it.
Push and pull.
Yeah, a lot of back and forth, unpredictable behaviors.
Okay, so we've got these different attachment styles that are often formed really early on. And it makes sense, right? Those first relationships, they lay the groundwork for how we see the world and how we relate to others. But I think the question a lot of people have at this point is, okay, so am I just stuck? Is this it?
That's the big question, right? And the good news is, no, you're not necessarily stuck.
Okay, phew.
While those early experiences have a big impact, they don't have to dictate your entire relational future.
So there is hope.
Absolutely.
Where does that hope start?
Awareness is key. Just recognizing your own attachment patterns, understanding why you might react in certain ways in relationships, that's the first step.
So even just knowing there's a reason behind those reactions can be powerful.
It can. It helps you start to separate your past from your present. You can say, okay, this reaction might be coming from my old blueprint, but it doesn't have to control me now.
Okay, so that's attachment theory. Let's move on to another big piece of the puzzle. Parental influence.
So your parents or your primary caregivers, whoever raised you, they are your first examples of what a relationship looks like.
Right. And they're modeling all kinds of things, not just how to show affection, but also how to handle conflict, how to communicate, how to, I don't know, even just be in the same room with another person sometimes.
Exactly. And if you grew up in a home where those things were modeled in a healthy way, where there was warmth and respect, you're more likely to seek out and create similar dynamics in your own relationships.
It's like you've got this positive relationship roadmap to follow.
Exactly.
But what if it wasn't so great? What if there was constant tension or maybe even like manipulation or emotional coldness? How does that tend to play out in someone's adult relationships?
Well, this is where we see what's sometimes called the cycle of dysfunction.
Meaning?
Well, if that's all you've ever known, that becomes your normal, right?
Right.
So you might unconsciously replicate those patterns in your own relationships. You might find yourself attracting partners who are emotionally unavailable, or you might have a really hard time communicating your needs.
Because you never really learned how.
Exactly. Or maybe conflict was handled with aggression or silence.
So you either explode or shut down completely.
Exactly. And it's not because you're a bad person or you're trying to make things difficult. It's just that you're operating from this old familiar script that you learned early on.
But you also mentioned that sometimes people might swing to the opposite extreme, right?
Right. Some people who grew up in difficult or controlling environments might overcorrect.
How so?
They might become fiercely independent, resist commitment, or choose partners who are completely emotionally unavailable, almost as a way to avoid repeating those dynamics from their childhood.
It's like anything but that.
Exactly.
But I guess that doesn't necessarily lead to healthy relationships either, right?
Not necessarily. It can create a whole other set of problems.
Okay. And then you mentioned this idea of emotional inheritance, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, it's not just about the behaviors you learn, but also the emotional baggage you might carry from your childhood.
So you're saying it's not just about what you saw your parents doing, but also how those experiences made you feel about yourself.
Exactly. So, for example, if you were constantly criticized as a child, you might grow up with this deep-seated feeling of not being good enough.
And you might carry that into your adult relationships, even if your partner is loving and supportive.
Right. It becomes your own internal critic, constantly whispering doubts and insecurities.
Okay, so we've talked about attachment, we've talked about parental influence. Now let's get into some of the even tougher stuff. Childhood trauma. How does that affect our ability to love and connect as adults?
When someone experiences significant trauma in childhood, whether it's neglect, abuse, or something else, it can have a profound impact on their ability to form healthy, trusting relationships later on.
It makes sense.
It's like your brain is in survival mode and
Yeah.
it develops all these defense mechanisms to protect you from getting hurt again.
So how might that show up in adult relationships?
Well, one common issue is a deep fear of abandonment.
Because you experienced it as a child.
Possibly. And so you're hypervigilant, constantly looking for any sign that your partner might reject you.
And that can make you really clingy or anxious.
It can. Or, on the other hand, some trauma survivors develop emotional numbing as a way to cope.
So they just shut down.
In a way, yeah, it's like they're protecting themselves by not letting themselves feel anything too deeply.
But that also makes it hard to be truly intimate, right?
It does.
And then there's that self-sabotage thing we talked about earlier.
Right. Some people with a history of trauma will actually push partners away before they can get too close.
Because they're afraid of getting hurt.
Exactly. It's like a preemptive strike against potential pain.
Okay, so it's clear that childhood experiences, especially those that are really difficult, can have a big impact on our adult relationships.
Mm-hmm.
But as you said earlier, it doesn't have to be a life sentence.
You're not doomed to repeat these patterns forever.
So let's talk about how to actually break free and create something healthier. Where do we start?
I think the most important thing is awareness. Like we were saying earlier, you have to understand your patterns, your triggers, your beliefs about love, and where they're coming from.
So really taking that honest look inward.
Exactly. Journaling can be helpful, talking to trusted friends, or even seeking therapy.
Yeah, therapy can be really powerful, especially when you're dealing with trauma.
Absolutely. It can help you process those past experiences and develop new, healthier ways of coping and connecting.
Okay, so once you have that awareness, what are some concrete steps you can take to actually change those patterns?
Well, one thing you can do is actively seek out different models of relationships. If all you've ever known is dysfunction, you might not even realize what a healthy relationship looks like.
So like finding examples of healthy communication or conflict resolution.
Exactly. You can find those examples in your own life or even in books or movies. It's about retraining your brain to recognize and value those healthy dynamics.
And speaking of retraining your brain, you mentioned emotional intelligence.
Yes, learning how to express your needs and feelings clearly and respectfully is so important. It's also about learning to recognize when your past is influencing your present reactions and being able to communicate about that with your partner.
So it's not just about knowing what you're feeling, but also being able to express it in a way that doesn't create more problems.
Right. And then practicing healthy conflict resolution is key. Learning how to disagree without resorting to those old patterns of fighting or shutting down.
Makes sense. And then there's the idea of seeking out secure attachments in adulthood.
Right. One of the most powerful ways to heal old attachment wounds is by experiencing secure, loving relationships in the present.
So finding a partner who is emotionally available, reliable, someone who actually makes you feel safe.
Exactly. And that experience of safety can gradually start to reshape those old patterns, almost like creating new neural pathways in your brain.
So it's like healing through connection. Now, I know there were some different viewpoints and debates around this whole topic of childhood and relationships. Can you talk about some of those?
Sure. One ongoing discussion is about the extent to which people can really change. Some people believe that our attachment styles and trauma responses are just too deeply ingrained to fully overcome.
But you're saying there is hope.
I think so. We're learning more and more about the brain's ability to change. It's called neuroplasticity. And it suggests that with the right effort and support, lasting change is definitely possible.
Okay, that's good to hear. What else?
Another point of debate is whether parental influence is the only or even the most significant factor in shaping our adult relationships. Some psychologists argue that peer relationships, later life experiences, even cultural factors can play a big role.
So it's not all about your parents.
Right, it's a complex interplay of many influences.
Okay. And then there's this question of whether you need to be totally healed before you can be in a healthy relationship.
Yeah, that's a big one. And
Yeah.
there's no easy answer.
Right, because it's not like you can just check a box and say, I'm healed, I'm ready to love.
Exactly. Healing is a process, and it's often ongoing. Some people believe that relationships themselves can be a catalyst for healing.
So you can heal within the context of a relationship.
Exactly. But it has to be the right relationship, one where there's awareness, communication, and a willingness to support each other's growth.
Okay, so to wrap things up, let's go back to those main takeaways about how childhood impacts adult relationships. We've talked about attachment styles, those blueprints for love that we form early on.
And how those early experiences with our caregivers shape our expectations for trust and intimacy.
Right, and we talked about the powerful influence of our parents, how they serve as models for love and conflict, and how we can either repeat or react against those patterns.
We also talked about how those early experiences, especially the difficult ones, can leave us with these emotional wounds that we carry into adulthood.
And how those wounds can show up in our relationships as fear of abandonment, emotional numbing, and even self-sabotage.
But the most important thing for you to remember is that while your childhood shapes you, it doesn't define you. Change is possible. You can rewrite your love story.
And it starts with that self-awareness piece we talked about, recognizing those patterns and where they're coming from.
And then from there, you can start to make different choices. You can consciously seek out healthier models of relationships, develop your emotional intelligence and communication skills, consider therapy, and most importantly, surround yourself with people who make you feel safe and loved.
And even though there are different perspectives on all this, the bottom line is that understanding the impact of your past gives you more power to create a different future for yourself.
Absolutely.
So as you think about your own relationships, ask yourself, how much of what's playing out now is an echo of my past? And how much is a result of the choices I'm making today? It's a question worth pondering.
It is. And hopefully this deep dive has given you some new insights and tools to help you navigate those complexities and create the kind of love you truly want and deserve.
And that's it for this deep dive. Until next time.